And I welcome everybody for today. And we're very lucky to have a guest speaker, David Matlow. And David had previously given this talk to a group that I was able to catch it and thought it would be a big interest. We've tended to, in many of the recent talks, focus on the 64, 65 World's Fair, Expo 67, the ones that a bunch of us have gone to. But I think when you go through David's talk today, you're going to find quite a few World's Fairs from the past that are going to be new points of information. And David and I were talking the other day, we were just doing a tech run through, and I was pretty impressed by the amount of information he has. And behind him, he's got quite a bunch of volumes of information. David, thought you might like to just share with the others some of what you shared with me on your overall collection and how that you got the World's Fair bug linked into it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I think we have three of us here from Toronto, so it's a rainy day here, so it's nice to be inside and dry. In behind me, you'll see boxes and binders. I have the world's largest collection of memorabilia about a gentleman named Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl was the visionary of the State of Israel. He lived from 1860 to 1904. And he had the idea to have a Jewish state as a solution to the anti-Semitism that was being experienced in Europe and elsewhere around the world at the time. And so he's the visionary of the State of Israel. And you'll see in the presentation how I go from Herzl to World's Fairs. And they're, in a sense, they're interrelated, a tangent to the Herzl collection, but also on the same theme. And so I'll get into that. Phil, do you want me to start, or is there?
Yeah, no, appreciate it. When one thing that's interesting is from the last time David did his talk until today, he made an interesting World's Fair legacy discussion we'll be talking about. So if anybody knows of any particular items or things that you can add to it later on, I'm just going to throw everybody on mute here so that we can just keep quiet. And then if there is a question or anything, again, throw it in chat. I can try to, bring it up to David if it's urgent, or at the end, I think Q&A, he'll find he's well versed in the subject. So with that, David, take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Bill, for inviting me. I've watched some of these presentations, so it feels like I'm being called up to the major leagues now to give this presentation. So I appreciate that. My first task is to screen share, so let's hope that works. Do you see that?
Yes, we do. It's looking good.
Okay. So the subject of this discussion today is pavilions of promise, and it's really talking about Israel. Israel was founded in 1948, but had a presence at World's Fairs even before it existed, and I'll be talking about that. And that presence was initiated by the Zionist movement, or Zionists who lived in the host cities. And I'll explain a bit what Zionism means for purposes of this discussion. I'll get to that in a bit. So what are the pavilions of promise? Why promise? Obviously, we're talking about the promised land, but it was also the promise for the Jewish people who, late 1800s into the middle of the 20th century, in many places, lived with the fear of anti-Semitism and really many risks that we don't appreciate in North America, though sadly they're starting to percolate back. So the pavilions of promise were a promise of a better future, independence, autonomy, the ability to be safe and secure. That is the pavilion of promise that I'm talking about. And as you know from various discussions about World's Fairs, Fairs historically, and maybe it was the purpose of it, right from the beginning, was to show off innovations, to show new technology, new progress, different ways of life in various places. Pavilions in host countries wanted to show off what they were doing. Companies wanted to introduce new technologies. Electricity in 1893, all about promoting a future. And so these pavilions of promise were doing the same thing, using the World's Fairs as a tool to communicate an idea to the world, and the idea was a homeland for the Jewish people, and what was being done to help promote that idea. So my first World's Fair was Expo 67 in Montreal. That's me eating an ice cream cone on the right with my sisters and my mother standing in front of the Israel Pavilion at Expo 67. I'm 6 years old here, and perhaps this is where my interest in World's Fairs was sparked. Many Canadians, I don't know if all, but probably a majority of Canadians found their way to Montreal in 1967. This was a celebration of Canada's 100th birthday and the decision of Canada to throw a party. And I know Bill has done a presentation on Expo 67. It was initially supposed to be in Moscow, but Moscow then backed out. So Canadians quickly organized this for Montreal. And like all World's Fairs, countries came to promote themselves and their businesses and their way of life, to promote trade and tourism. And here the Israel Pavilion, this was at an interesting time in the history of Israel. So there was the Six-Day War was in 1967, in June of 1967. The fair opened, I believe, in April. And there was a very tense period of time in Israel in the lead up to the Six-Day War. And of course, the Six-Day War, historic and has repercussions that for some are very difficult, but in any event was a miraculous victory. And this Israel Pavilion at the World's Fair became a place where people went to find information, to celebrate, firstly to worry in the period before, to celebrate the miraculous victory afterwards. And lots of people went to this fair to this pavilion to understand, to learn about Israel, what was happening, so much so that this particular pavilion had twice as many people go to it that they had anticipated. 5.5 million visitors went to the Israel Pavilion at Expo 67, which was twice what they expected. So this is my interest, perhaps where it sparked in World's Fairs. But how do World's Fairs trip over to my interest in Theodore Herzl? And like all good stories, it starts with a $2 postcard, which you'll see on the right. This is a postcard of a element, I assume it's an indoor portion of the American Israel Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair in New York. For me, if anything that has Herzl on it qualifies for my collection. So there's this art installation was inside the pavilion. I can tell from the back of the postcard, and it includes Theodore Herzl's motto. If this is in biblical language, but usually it said, "If you will it, it is no legend, or it is no dream." And this was his message to the world, that if you want something, whatever it might be, and work hard to make it happen, it can be made to happen. And he was focusing on his idea for a Jewish homeland, but that's a motto that applies for anything. When I speak about Herzl to young groups of youngsters, school-aged kids, I tell them anything that you set your mind to and want to work towards can happen. That's what Herzl's talking about. On the left, that's Herzl himself. This picture was taken in 1903. This is a piece from my collection. It's Herzl, and he's in Basel, Switzerland, at the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel. And this is an iconic image of Herzl looking into the future. The future was a better future for the Jewish people. But what's interesting about this item is you can see under the picture is the signature Herzl, and other signatures as well. But he was he was a superstar. He was a rock star. People went up to him and asked him to sign his own picture. And I just include one item in my collection to show how significant a person this was, and so much so that his motto was an element of the 1964 American Israel Pavilion at the World's Fair. So this is an audience mostly of World's Fair aficionados, people knowledgeable, the first World Fair. took place in 1851 in London, and that's the Crystal Palace. In 1935, the Bureau of International Expositions was established to qualify or sanction World's Fairs. And so this on the left is a list of the World's Fairs that were retroactively qualified before 1935, as pulled off the website of the BIE, through to the fair in 1967 that I was at in Montreal. And when I did this presentation the last time, I received many questions. Why isn't the 1964 World's Fair in New York on that list? And the reason is it was not sanctioned by the BIE for a number of reasons, including there was a World's Fair in Seattle 2 years previously that Robert Moses, who initiated the fair, wanted it to run for 2 years and can only run for 1 year, and also that pavilions were being charged to participate, which was against the rules. So that's why 1964 is not on that list. And as all World's Fair fans know, that every World's Fair has a signature item, a marquee element. And so Paris in 1889 was the Eiffel Tower. In 1893 in Chicago was the Ferris wheel. This Ferris wheel, you will see again, the exact same one reappeared in 1904 in St. Louis. And speaking of St. Louis, brought us the ice cream cone, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner. There was a World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. It was called the Colonial Exhibition. We learn in school that happened in 1492. So maybe they required an extra year in order to plan this, because this was in 1893. And as part of this World's Fair was something called the Midway Plaisance. This is how we get the term Midway in various exhibitions and World's Fairs and carnivals came from this. And I did hear a presentation maybe about this World's Fair, another where Bill Cotter said that there were human zoos at these World's Fairs. They were formerly called foreign villages, but in the foreign villages they would bring exotic people so that the fair attendees can look at people, walk around, see how they lived. And in this World's Fair in Chicago, there were these foreign villages for Laplanders, Sudanese, Algerians, and there was a Turkish village. In 1893, the area that we now know as Israel, together with Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and that whole area was part of the Ottoman Empire, which we would know now today as originating in Turkey. So the Turkish village, Turkey would have been thought to include Palestine or the land of Israel. Two Jewish people were given the concession to run the Turkish village at this World's Fair in 1893, and they hired people who they knew or people who, through second or third degree contacts. So 80% of the people who lived in the fair at the Turkish village were Jewish. And so this wasn't about Israel, but this was about Jewish people. And at the end, there was a book put together of the various people who lived in these in these foreign villages. And here are 6 pictures just of typical Jews. So were Jews on display. But interesting, in the 1893 World's Fair, on Yom Kippur, one of the high holidays, the Day of Atonement, the Jewish community who was living in the Turkish village had high holiday services in the fake mosque that was part of the Turkish village display. In 1896, there was an exposition, what's called the Colonial Exhibition, that took place in Berlin. And there was an industrial exposition which had as a portion a colonial exhibition. And I know the word colonial is very value laden. And so obviously we have to think about it, how the word was used at the time. But there were three colonial exhibitions that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Three different countries, each of them included Palestine or the land of Israel as part of their colonial exhibitions. And this particular one in 1896, there was this house, which was an exhibition of items from Israel or in the Holy Land. It was a two-room exhibition. In one room, there was a display of agricultural products, and in the other, there was a sale of wine, olive wood, books that were printed in the land of Israel. So this was the beginning of a presence of Israel industry, commerce, agriculture, rather than simply the display of Jewish people at a World's Fair. This particular colonial exhibition also had what they called Volkshow, shows of people, folks, and mostly African villages. And this particular booth or house was part of the Egyptian portion of the colonial exhibition, and it really reflected the close ties between Germany and the Ottoman Empire around this time. Coming back to the United States, this is these are pictures from the 1904 World's Fair, which took place in St. Louis. This particular World's Fair was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. And on the World's Fair grounds, as one of the key attractions, was a model of Jerusalem. It was a 10-acre model. Now, models of Jerusalem, small or room size, was something that was very typical for hundreds of years before this, showing the fascination with the Holy Land, mostly from a Christian religious perspective. Of course, Jerusalem is holy to three religions, but this particular site was 10 acres in size. Just the Ferris wheel, it's the exact same Ferris wheel that was up in Chicago, was taken down and was somewhere else, and then reinstalled here in St. Louis. To the right is the prospectus. It was to raise funds to create this model. It was a business initiative, mostly of Christian investors who, as you see from the bottom right, charged 25 cents for admission, and you could walk around what it's like to be on the streets of Jerusalem, a compressed version because the various sites are much closer together, of course, than they are in the real Jerusalem, but you could go from the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all models within a few minutes of one another. And several hundred residents of Jerusalem were brought to live in the World's Fairgrounds so that people who walked through the model could see what it's like to walk through the streets of the holy city of Jerusalem and go to the bazaar and negotiate for knickknacks. And in fact, camels and donkeys were brought from Palestine to St. Louis so people could go on rides through the streets of Jerusalem. So this was Jerusalem from a religious, mostly Christian perspective, but the St. Louis World's Fair was the first. Oh, well, here's this picture gives you an indication of the scope and size of this model. As well, this World's Fair was the first time that a connection was made between the World's Fairs and the aspirations of the Zionist movement. So let me just take a moment to explain what Zionism meant at this particular time, to show what it was that you'll see in this fair and fairs that follow, that people were trying to communicate through the World's Fairs. So I indicated earlier that Herzl was the visionary of the state of Israel. He founded a movement, that was called the Zionist Movement, and in a Congress that was held in Basel in 1897, 6 years before the picture of Herzl on the balcony, there was a resolution to explain what Zionism is. And Zionism simply was to seek to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally assured homeland in Palestine, which included the promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. At the time, Palestine was then southern Syria, part of the Ottoman Empire, and what I'm referring to as Palestine is the land of Israel. I know there's border disputes, and you can slice and dice it many ways, but that's generally what we're talking about. And generally, the aspiration of Zionism was a homeland for the Jewish people in what was then called Palestine. And so here you see this flag that looks very much like the current flag of the State of Israel, flying at the 1904 World's Fair. But the State of Israel didn't exist until 1948. So what is that flag doing there? You can see right below it the stars and stripes, or at least the stars of the American flag. And what that was that a local St. Louis Zionist, so someone who was in favor of this movement, prevailed upon the organizers of the World's Fair to fly this Zionist flag among the nations of the world. This flag was the flag of the Zionist movement, which was adopted by the State of Israel when it was created. And this, frankly, is the first time that this particular flag flew in an international setting. Previously, it would have been at Jewish parades or in Jewish related meetings, but never flown in an international setting. So this was a gentleman named Michael Stiffelman, and he had the vision to use the World's Fair as an opportunity to communicate the message of Zionism. And by flying this flag here, it really was quite historic for the Zionist movement, because it gave the Zionist movement international recognition and legitimacy, because this flag of a country that didn't yet exist was flying among the flags of the world. The Ottoman Empire, as I said, was part of Turkey, and in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled because the Ottoman Empire, together with the Germans and the other nations, were on the losing side, and so there was a transition of authority in that area, and what became known as Palestine and now land of Israel, or State of Israel, became part of the British Mandate. And in 1924, there was a British Empire exhibition which included a Palestine Pavilion. So now this is the second country. The first was Germany. This is now England that considered Palestine as part of their colonial expanse. And here, this wasn't a World's Fair, but it was an international exposition which included a Palestine Pavilion. In the land of Israel itself, starting in 1924, there was an understanding that trade and commerce and tourism and business was critical to having a thriving state whenever that opportunity came. So an organization called Mischar V'Ta'asiyah, it's a Hebrew words for trade and industry, was established by a gentleman named Alexander Ezer. He was a Jew from Siberia. A real name was Evzerov, who moved to Palestine in the 1920s. And he started this company which made publications, but also started an exhibition or exposition arm, starting in 1924 in Tel Aviv, to start to show products that were made in the area and the business. And this exposition grew and grew, so that by the 1930s, 1932, 34, 36, there were international fairs, not World's Fairs, they were called Levant fairs, that took place in Tel Aviv every 2 years. And by the time we got to 1934 or 36, There were 800 exhibitors, mostly businesses, some countries, but it was to promote trade, and hundreds of thousands of people came. Tel Aviv only had 35,000 people at that time, but hundreds of thousands of people came over the number of months of the fair. But what's critical about this is this company, Mischar V'Ta'asya, Trade and Industry, develop an expertise in expositions. And that expertise we're going to hear about multiple times as we move forward back into World's Fairs. And then in 1933, there was an Anglo-Palestine exhibition in London, and this this Mischar V'Ta'asya company was hired to establish this exhibition, again showing off what was happening, the development, the industry, the business that was going on in the land of Palestine, area of Palestine. Back to World's Fairs. In 1931, there was a World's Fair in Paris that was called the Colonial Exhibition. So now this is the third time that Palestine is included and in a colonial exhibition of another country. This time it's Paris. And this was a joint venture between local Zionists. So these were French Jews mostly, if not exclusively, who were trying to advance the cause of Zionism, the aspirations for homeland, working together with Mischar V'Ta'asya company to develop this secure the spot, create the pavilion, build it, run it. In 1933, there was a World's Fair in Chicago. And this was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of Chicago. And it was decided by the local Jewish community not to have a pavilion at this World's Fair, but instead create a spectacle, a pageant, a giant show, which was called the Romance of a People. It took place on the eve of the 4th of July, July 3rd, 1933, in Soldiers Field in Chicago. You'll see a picture of it on the top right. There were 130,000 people in attendance at Soldiers Field that day to see this Romance of a People. And it told the story of the history of the Jewish people from the days of Abraham through to the days of the pioneers who were working the land in the land of Israel at that time. And this took place. There were three objectives for this spectacle, and it was initiated by a gentleman named Meyer Weisgau, who will surface again in this story, who was an organizer for the Zionist movement in Chicago. One was to unify the Jewish community of Chicago, and he was quite smart. He involved school groups and camp groups and youth groups in the show, knowing that if a kid was in the show, their parents, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles will all come to see them in the show, which is one of the reasons where there were 130,000 people. That this might have been the most popular, well-attended day for the Chicago World's Fair of 1933. The second reason was to give profile to the Zionist movement, like the flag in St. Louis, but also this was 1933, and the storm clouds of Nazism were gathering and well known in America. And so one of the objectives of this event was to raise money to rescue the Jews of Germany. And the bottom right is a picture of Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the Zionist movement, among other people. And he came to there because he was involved in trying to rescue German Jewry. And I think about $100,000 was raised for this purpose. This show was so well attended. A second show took place on July 5th, and then it went on tour. It was performed it was supposed to be performed in the Polo Grounds in New York in September of 1933, but it was rained out. And so it moved to an armory somewhere in northern Manhattan and ran for a month, and 1 million people came to see it in New York. Um, and it really both galvanized unity for the Jewish people and not other people who were supportive. It's not just Jews who were supportive of the Jewish homeland, and also drew attention to what was beginning to be a significant and huge worry as to what was happening to the Jews of Germany and Europe at the time. At the same World's Fair, there was in Chicago, there was a Jewish exhibit as part of the Hall of Religion. So this was more standard displays of Jewish objects and rituals and people and personalities. So Chicago happened to have both the Zionist element through the spectacle and a couple shelves in the Hall of Religion simply about what Judaism is about. In 1935, there was a World's Fair in Brussels. It's really not politically correct. The motto, peace between the races, which was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Belgian Congo. But there was a World's Fair and there was a Palestine exhibition here. This is a postcard from the Palestine exhibition. And to the left, it's small writing, but there's the restaurant Carmel, because if you went to the World's Fair and wanted the Palestine Pavilion, how could you not have a snack when you visited the pavilion? And we'll see this again in the New York World's Fair. In 1937, there was an international World's Fair in Paris. So there was a Land of Israel in Palestine Pavilion. This is the cover of a booklet of postcards. It was a joint venture again between the Mishar V'Tasiya and local Zionists. And obviously, World's Fairs always take place in the context of what's happening in the world at that time. So I started by talking about the 1967 and in the lead up to the Six-Day War. In 1937, there was obviously the rise of Nazism, and this was of great concern to the Jewish people in Europe. And my friend Paul, who's watching, he lived in Europe at this time and experienced what I'm alluding to, not the subject of this discussion, but there was the rise of Nazism, and there was an urgency to find a place for the Jewish people to go and to demonstrate the capability for Israel, the land of Israel, to be a home for the Jewish people. And that's why this pavilion was there, to show that there is progress and things that are advancing, which I will show you in a minute. This particular pavilion was a block or two away from the Nazi Germany pavilion, which is quite ironic, quite a juxtaposition. And this pavilion was in the national zone of the World's Fair. World's Fairs have different zones: commercial, community, business, entertainment. This was the national zone. And this pavilion was filled with showing the cultural, social, intellectual vitality of what the Jewish people were doing in Palestine as a juxtaposition to what Nazi Germany was doing at the same time, was dehumanizing the Jewish people. So let's take a quick look inside what was happening in the pavilion. And I'm fortunate to have these pictures because they were at the Zionist archives in Jerusalem. So in the middle is a picture. You can see it was quite a sizable pavilion from the drawing, but there were various booths showing some of the activities that were going on. Some of it needs explanation. So in the top left, JNF, that's the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund was founded in 1901 to buy land and plant trees in Palestine, and Jews around the world would make contributions in little blue boxes or other ways, a penny at a time, to buy land which was primarily owned by absentee Arab landowners at the time. KH, you'll see in the top left, the Karen Haisod, translated is to the Foundation Fund. This was another vehicle to raise money to begin to create the infrastructure in the state. electrical power plants, highways, roads, things like that. It was part of the British mandatory government, but this was incremental uh, work that was needed to prepare this land to be a thriving country. And it was a lot about pioneering, the working of the land, again, to be able to demonstrate that give the Jewish people this land, we will be able to um, be the home for the imperial Jews of Europe at the time. Everyone knew that there was big trouble in Europe at the time for the Jewish people, which obviously turned out to be horrifically true. More pictures from inside. Um, on the top left, even though we learned French in Canada up to grade 12, I needed some help translating this. You see it, the quote along the top. This is again inside the Paris Pavilion, and this is a quote from Herzl himself. And what it says is, when the plow will be in the grip of the Jewish farmer, we will hold the solution for the Jewish question. The Jewish question is a euphemism for anti-Semitism. That's the Jewish question. What do we do with Jewish? Every country had to deal with the Jewish people. That's the question. What do we do with them? And this is really saying, let us build the land. Let us work the land. We can look after ourselves. So this is more examples of the development, the cities, the farms, going on, preparing for a homeland there. Which we now migrate to 1939, which is the next World's Fair, was conceived of or started to be talked about in 1936 or presumably previously by New York business people as a way for employment, to get out of the Depression. And there was a proposal to create a fair to be in 1939, which was the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration in New York City. And you see here, the theme was the building the world of tomorrow. And you will have seen and heard this in in Bill's presentations about the 39 and 64 World's Fair. It was in Queens, in what's now Corona Park in Flushing. It was called at the time the Valley of Ashes, and to the left is an excerpt from The Great Gatsby, where and this is pictured in the movie The Great Gatsby with Leonardo DiCaprio, but it was a valley of ashes where ashes grew like wheat into grotesque gardens, and that's a picture of the site on the right. 90-foot tall piles of ashes. And this was because the coal burning stoves that people used at the time, the ashes at the end were picked up and dumped here. So part of the goal of the World's Fair was to clean up this site, make it into a usable, beautiful park. And so that was the plan, to have it in 39 at this spot. So, and that's what happened. This, at the time, there were, I think, 1.7 million Jewish people in New York and the New York region. And so this was obviously a good spot to attract interest for this same initiative of the Zionist movement and advancing the cause of the Zionist movement. On the left is a copy of the guide to the World's Fair written in Yiddish. And on the right, it's just it's an excerpt from it, the Land of Israel Pavilion. That's what it says in the large print on the right. Now, there's a Jewish holiday of Sukkot that comes in the fall, where part of the tradition is to have a palm frond, which is a long green stem, and a citron, which like a lemon, so it's called a lulav and an etrog, and you may have seen pictures of people walking with this. When you look at the Trilon and the Paris Fair on the left, which was the signature marquee symbol of the World's Fair, Jewish people called this the lulav and the etrog, because it had the Trilon, of course, long and sort of like a palm frond, and the round being the etrog. So this was the lulav and the etrog, which was as described by some Jewish people. But the American Economic Committee for Palestine, which was a bunch of Jewish business leaders, thought that it was important to have a pavilion on this in this World's Fair, and got together to organize to make it happen. And that same gentleman, Meyer Weisgall, who organized the spectacle in Chicago, was brought in to help organize the pavilion. It was decided for this World's Fair at this particular time, it was important to have a pavilion. And you'll see the sculpture on the right. This comes up a number of times. This is three figures, and I'll describe this again. And so this is a picture of the on a postcard from for the World's Fair. There's that sculpture again above the door. The Zionist flag, because it's not the flag of the state of Israel, because the country didn't exist until 9 years later, and people going to visit this pavilion. And you'll see various trees, shrubs, bushes. The notion of Meyer Weisgall was everything in this pavilion needs to come from Palestine. So all of the art, it had a Palestinian, and when I say Palestinian, Palestine at this time there were Jewish Palestinian and Arab Palestinians. This is Jewish Palestinians, and I know it's confusing, but this was to show the handiwork of Jewish Palestinians, art and exhibits, and 50 different kinds of plants and shrubs were brought to New York. Lemons, oranges, grapefruits, palm trees, to decorate the outside of the pavilion, so that you're at least seeing an artist's rendition of this. There was a debate between the Meyer Weisgall and Grover Whalen, who was the head of this World's Fair committee. Where should this pavilion be? And what should it be called? Because Palestine was not a country, and there were those who said you can't call this the Palestine Pavilion, even though it was called Palestine in Paris and Brussels before it, because Palestine is not only Jewish, which is true. And so it ended up being called the Jewish Palestine Pavilion, not that there was an Arab Palestine or a Christian Palestine. This was the only representation from that area in the World's Fair. And then where should it be? And there was a debate. It cannot be in the government zone, in the country zone, because it's not a country. So it wound up being in the community interest zone. And so on the left is the guidebook, and the right is the map of the community interest zone. Together it was there with the YMCA and the manufacturers of asbestos and radiators and religions, but it was not in the nation zone, though it was quite close to the nation zone. It was literally a half a block away from the nation zone. And just to give you a sense of some of the struggles involved in, I guess, the perspective of Jewish people, this is an excerpt from this very same guidebook. It's not the excerpt, actually, it's the entire paragraph about this pavilion. And it just talks about what's in there, the accomplishments, reclamation of swamps, irrigation, all the advancements. And then it says, because of the significance is an answer, and parts blocked, so if I'm not reading it correctly, but the last four lines, an answer to the claims of unproductiveness leveled against the Jew, the pavilion has received the united support of the Jews of America. So even in this description of the pavilion is the description of an anti-Semitic canard about the Jewish people, about unproductiveness. And it's quite interesting that that's how it was described in the guidebook. But it does talk about how the pavilion was funded, and it was indeed funded by contributions from the Jewish community. On the left is a voucher, a ticket to an attraction within the pavilion. The rules of the World's Fair are you cannot charge people to come to see the pavilion. If you want to go see the Thailand pavilion, you can walk in the pavilion. There's no incremental charge. But if there's a special attraction, then you can charge for it. So what was done was that 2 million advance tickets were sold for the to go to this advanced attraction, and I have a few pictures of it. It was called the Holy Land of Yesterday and Tomorrow. So there were 2 million tickets sold at 25 cents. That was raised $500,000, but it was sold by charitable organizations. So if you sold a ticket, you got to keep half the proceeds for your own charitable work. If it was a synagogue, a school, a Boy Scout group, whatever it was, the other 25 cents goes to the pavilion, and that's how $250,000 was raised to fund the pavilion by the sale of these tickets on the left. This pavilion, for reasons I'll describe in a second, became very, very popular, well more attended than anyone had thought. And as a result, more money was needed to help hire more docents, more guides, more security, whatever. So in the middle of the fair, this letter on the right is from August of 1939. It's reflective of a round of funding to say we need more money to help run this thing because it's so popular. And here is a $5 contribution that was made by the Jewish National Workers Alliance. And I'm sure that a request was made from many. And so this was the second most popular pavilion at the World's Fair, at that World's Fair. The cornerstone was laid in 1938, in May of 1938. From the left is the program from that. Thomas Mann, the writer, was there. He's not Jewish, but he was there. He was a refugee from Germany, so was familiar with what was happening. And you just from the pavilion, it says that this dedication, what we're trying to do here is an example for the Jewish people, a ray of light pointing to a future of hope and security from the ancient Jewish homeland, and to lay the foundations on which homeless Jews might build a free life for themselves. This was obviously, everyone knew what was happening in Europe at the time and the desperate situation that the Jews of Europe were finding themselves in at the time. In the right is an article that appeared in the paper at the time, but what's relevant about this is it includes a quote from Harold Jacoby, who's the co-chair of the Pavilion Committee, that says that this pavilion is focusing on Jewish accomplishments in Palestine. We're not denigrating any other population. We're not saying that this is ours to the exclusion of other people. We're just showing what we're doing and what we're capable of doing, with obviously important consideration. So let's a little bit about the Palestine Pavilion. This on the right, you see the flag again outside the administration pavilion of the World's Fair. This was the guidebook on the left, which has the quote that what is the pavilion about? It's a moral utterance, the refusal of a people to be driven into bitterness, panic, and despair. This is the opening of the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. And the pavilion was opened 10 days after the British passed a white paper. The white paper was the British essentially saying that immigration of Jewish people to Palestine was restricted at precisely the time where their Jews of Europe needed a place to go. And so it's not, again, that's not the subject of this discussion, but as a result of that, the Jewish Palestine Pavilion became a rallying point for the Jewish people to protest the white paper, to find unity with one another, and that's 100,000 people came to the opening of this pavilion, and Albert Einstein spoke at the opening. Obviously, that's Einstein in the middle. To the right, with a smile of satisfaction, as should be, is Meyer Weisgau, who was responsible for organizing this pavilion. And again, this is a quote by Einstein in his remarks that even though World's Fairs talk about all the good things that are happening in the world at that time, there are sinister and destructive ones which jeopardize the happiness and the existence of civilized humanity. This was in April of 1939. And we obviously know that World War II broke out in the middle of the fair in September 1st, 1939. Um, let's take a little bit of look through the fair, or tour of the fair. This is as you walk up to the fair, and you can see the trees and shrubs that I described. This is this is in front of the front door. This is Herzl Day. That same Herzl. This is another reason why I got interested. That sculpture behind the Israeli and American flag. That's Herzl, for Herzl Day. And here, these are two young women who were holding the flags in front of the pavilion. This is the front door to the pavilion. It's made of eucalyptus wood. Eucalyptus wood was very important in Palestine to drain the swamps that were there. And on it are the shields of the 12 ancient tribes of from the biblical times. This is going into the pavilion. Above the door, you can see the quote I referred to earlier that was in the pavilion in 1964 as well. If you will it is not a dream. And this is obviously opening day as people come into the pavilion behind a group of folk dancers. There was a memorial plaque right when you got in, and this was a memorial to people who in the land of Palestine, there was violence, tension, friction in the 1930s. So this was a memorial to those who were trying to defend the land at that time. And this excerpt in the bottom left was from 1940. There was a day of prayer that President Roosevelt declared for the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the Second World War. Was September 8th, 1940. And so there was a prayer service at the Temple of Religion in the World's Fairgrounds. And then there was over to the Jewish Palestine Pavilion to lay a wreath, which you see in the picture in the middle. That's that sculpture of Herzl there. And on the right is Edgar G. Robinson, the actor, signing a guest book from the Jewish National Fund. That's the tree and land purchasing organization I talked about earlier. And going through, there's the Hall of Transformation, of pioneers, how the land is being improved to the land of promise. Agriculture, this is Einstein, presumably learning something about agriculture on the left, as he looks at farming and development and working the land and new technologies for irrigation and tree planting and fruits that are growing in the Holy Land. The Hall of Industry, which is showing the various industries which were, in addition to agriculture, porcelain, printing, products of different kinds that were being made there. Olive oil, potash, porcelain, soap. Hall of Culture. This was part of the revival of the Hebrew language. So the newspapers, plays, musicals, books being published. Labor and social reforms, that there were kibbutzim, which were communal farms, an organized labor organization, and how labor and work was organized early on. It was labor from the Labor Party intensive kind of work, communal, progressive notions of free medical care and looking at wages and limitations of hours and holidays was part of the new society that was being dealt with and discussed in this section. The Hall of Health, which was talking about medical innovations, cures for tuberculosis, malaria, a building of hospitals, modern medical approaches, which was organized by the Hadassah Organization of America, which is a women's organization looking after health and children's concerns. And in that pavilion, there was a sale of postcard or a distribution of postcards from Hadassah showing the various work that was being done, rescuing Jews from fascist lands. You'll see in this postcard. In others, lunch services, care for orphans, um, uh, people in Europe who felt their children were imperiled, which they were, would send their children out even without their parents. And there were communal schools in Israel to look after them, care for tuberculosis, etc. These are the kinds of things that Hadassah showed off. These postcards were distributed in the pavilion itself. And then there was this Holy Land of Yesterday and Tomorrow. This was the area of the pavilion which had was available for that 25-cent ticket. This was a model on the left of the temple in the time of biblical times, the Second Temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. This was the temple from the time of Jesus as well. On the right is dioramas of Tel Aviv showing the progress between it being a desert by the beach in 1909 to a thriving city in 1939. And again, from that Yiddish booklet, just an example of the size of the temple diorama. There was also an art exhibition there where there were 50 or so Jewish Palestinian artists whose art was shown there. There was a room economic information office where you could get pamphlets and booklets if you wanted to invest, donate, go to university there, support the university, various things to help support this initiative. There was a gift shop which sold these characters. These are not modern Israeli characters by any stretch. These are the grandpa and grandma from the old country. And this particular item was made in Syracuse of some kind of fake wooden polymer, but somehow found its way to be sold in this pavilion. The pin, Palestinian products through a concessionaire called the Palestine House, which continued to have a store in Israel, in New York, at least until 1960. So bottom left, you'll see jewelry. On the right, it's a little notepad, which has that sculpture that I highlighted earlier, the three figures. Those three figures are called the scholar, the laborer, and the tiller of soil, which was indicative of what the perception of the Jewish homeland would look like. Study, agriculture, and industry. And of course, there was a cafe there, Cafe Tel Aviv, where you could get a snack at the end of your time in the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. This was a central rallying point, as I mentioned, for Jewish people and supporters of the Zionist dream. So an organization called the American Zionist Organization had their annual convention there in 1939. And this organization, together with Hadassah that I mentioned, and the Jewish National Fund and the Karen Haisod, these four organizations were also seed funders of this pavilion, in addition to the 25 cents at a time that I mentioned previously, helped to finance this. Albert Einstein, this is a picture in Life magazine of him leaving the pavilion. And I just love this picture on the right. That's Einstein's sister, Maya, and they probably have similar genetic disposition with respect to their hair. The World's Fair continued for a second year, and then it was dismantled, as all World's Fairs are. I know Bill did a book about the dismantling of the 1964 World's Fair. And the intention when this pavilion was established was for the items to go back to Palestine. But because of the World War, there were limitations on shipping, so the items couldn't go back. And so they were all sold at a sale that took place between September and October 1940. And to the left is the catalog from the sale. And from that catalog, one's able to tell what was inside the pavilion and what some of these things sold for. So on the right is this Yisker, this memorial board, which I showed earlier. It was right at the entrance. This was purchased by a philanthropist in Cleveland It was then embedded in the wall of a synagogue in Cleveland, the Tiferet Israel Synagogue, which has since been sold, uh, and it is now an auditorium. It's called the Maltz Auditorium at the Case Western University. And embedded in the wall of the lobby of this theater is this board to this day. Bill mentioned at the outset, somebody surfaced after my last presentation to identify where a couple more things were, which were bought by that auction. I could see that that memorial board, the price was $500. The top left, I showed this picture previously. This was the doors to the pavilion. They were purchased by somebody who then donated them to the Temple Mount Sinai Synagogue in El Paso, Texas. And that's a picture in the left, bottom left, of what it looked like at the time. And there's a little blurb that says one of the features of this temple is that it has the doors that were in the Palestine Pavilion in 1939. This synagogue was sold and a new synagogue was built, and they took the doors with them. This is a recent picture to the right of those doors from the pavilion. And here's another picture of the doors, and above the doors are 12 signs of the zodiac, and those also were in the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. And I can tell from the catalog that the symbols of the zodiac were sold for $1,500, and the main door of the Palestine Pavilion I can't see because it's blocked by Carol's picture, but I think it's $2,500. They were bought by somebody who then brought them to El Paso. And then there is this sculpture. It's 14 feet tall. It sat above the door, as you saw multiple times, by an artist named Maurice Ascalon, who was a Jewish Palestinian. Well, he's from Romania, but then moved to live in Tel Aviv, made the sculpture. He then later moved to New Jersey, and his son and his grandson live in New Jersey. The artist passed away, but they still live in New Jersey and are in the same business, metalworks for synagogues and churches and other religious sites. And this is a picture of the artist making it, and you can see the size of it. And this was sold at that auction for $2,500. This is an excerpt from the auction catalog. And it was purchased by a philanthropist who donated it to Spertus College, which is in Chicago. The sculpture was out on Michigan Avenue for many years, and then was taken down and then taken indoors. So you can see a picture of it indoors here. And then it was taken down about 30 years ago. This is Eric Ascalon, who's the grandson of the artist, visited the sculpture. It's in storage about 10 years ago. And I'm working now with Eric and his dad and Spertus to have this sculpture returned to Israel to be put on public display in Israel. It's an iconic piece, and hopefully within the next couple of years, this will see its light of day again, back around the place where it was made in Tel Aviv or Haifa or some other city in Israel today, to have gone full circle, returning to Israel where it should have, but for the World War in 1940. A conservationist went in because we need to understand what it's like now, what's required in order to safely move it. So these are pictures of it within the last year by a conservationist, and there's some work to do. It's the same kind of structure, though much smaller, of course, the Statue of Liberty. It's that kind of repose kind of work, I'm told. Coming to the end, as World's Fair buffs will know, that this pin was handed out at the General Motors Pavilion at the World's Fair. I have seen the future. This was about building the world of tomorrow. And in fact, the future foreseen in the Jewish Palestine Pavilion was actualized. This, what was the New York Pavilion, at the City of New York Pavilion at the World's Fair, which is now the Queen's Museum in Flushing, was for a period of time the temporary home of the United Nations. And on November 29th, 1947, in this building, and this is a picture of it on the right, in the I don't know, 200 meters, 220 yards from the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. In this building on the World's Fair site, a resolution of the United Nations was passed to create the State of Israel, which was envisioned by the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. The future really was actualized on these World's Fair grounds. 70 years later, in the same building, there was a celebration of this momentous United Nations resolution. After Israel was created, it didn't need to rely on Zionists and host countries to have its pavilions at World's Fair, so that it was represented in Brussels, New York, which we talked about, which was actually not the government because of quirk in the rules of the World's Fair that countries couldn't participate because it wasn't sanctioned, and in other cities at the time, taking us to the World's Fair in Dubai today, which it looks like Jim Brown has a picture of it right behind on his screen share. This opened earlier this month. It's historic, an Israel pavilion at a World's Fair held in an Arab nation. This is the first World's Fair held in an Arab nation, and Dubai invited all countries to participate, and Israel accepted this invitation even before the Abraham Accords, which was the peace treaty entered into between Dubai, Bahrain, and Israel. But there is an Israel pavilion in Dubai, and so this is the pavilion has no walls to it, and you'll see there's Arabic script at the top. It's talking about towards tomorrow. From what I understand, there's a display of technology and progress of what's happening in Israel and contributions in agriculture and technology. The World's Fairs are designed to allow us to see the future, and they demonstrate the future that people wish or hope or dream about, and they help to build it. As we saw for Jewish Palestine, it helped, and the Jewish Palestine Pavilion in 1939, it helped to perform that pavilion into existence. And let this the hope when we talk about pavilions of promise, that just like the first pavilions of pre-1948 were pavilions with a promise of a Jewish homeland, that this pavilion is a promise of peace in that very homeland, which, regardless of your view on Israel or Palestine, I think is universally something that everyone wants. So hopefully this is a pavilion of promise, which is the promise of a future of peace for everyone in the area. So I want to thank you for listening, for participating, for inviting me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, I want to thank you again for doing it. I can't think how many hours you must have put into sourcing some of those little treasures that you've unearthed. That's very impressive. So I'll turn it over to others. Questions, thoughts, observations that folks may have. Paul, you should be able to unmute yourself there. By the way, Harold, the other gentleman from Toronto, dropped a note saying he had to leave early, but he's looking forward to watching the rest of it. And thank you for doing it. Here you are, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank David for having invited me. I didn't expect much, but I got much more than I expected. It's interesting. You know where I'm coming from. David and I explained it to you. I'm a student of history, as you know, and I've lived through all this myself. But what you've done is extremely valuable. Why? Because you've shown history through pictures. And this is much more telling. You know, today's generation of young Jews in Israel, outside of Israel, they should all see this. The picture better than 1,000 words, and you proved it. With all my awareness and knowledge, I got completely engrossed. I saw this graphic history to your pictures and the way you connected the dots. That's a tremendous contribution. This program itself should be preserved and used as an educational tool. That's my opinion. Sorry, I'm not sorry, but I'm happy to be able to say that. Only one negative note, not about what you did. What you did is priceless. But when I watched all this, and the positive tone and the climax, and how this thing grew and became better and better until 39, when you mentioned what happened in Europe. You know, on the one hand, the feeling I got, that's very personal, I don't want to take anything away, is the sadness that with all this buildup and all these beautiful promises, the catastrophe that came to us after that, destroying most of our people. I felt, you know how I felt? As if I'd shown a show extolling the beauty of the Titanic just before it hit the iceberg.
Right.
And then sank. I'm sorry I have to say that. Doesn't take anything away. This is history, but there's also another part of history that should also be taken into account. Okay, I said I don't want all the speech. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
It's a fair comment, and it's always I'm fascinated by the World's Fair because World War broke out in the middle, and people were going on midway rides, and there were the Holocaust was underway, and there's all kinds of things going on all over the world, and people still went to World's Fairs in America and participated, and then it opened for a second year, and the like. The reason I turned around is Paul is a scholar on this subject. He wrote this book, and I know you're 87 years old. He just got his doctorate on this subject, so he knows, and he lived through this, the experiences that he talks about, which is obviously not a subject for a World's Fair discussion. But you're absolutely right. This party was going on while people of all kinds were suffering in other places in the world. But I suppose that's always happens whenever there's a World's Fair in one place. There's a party. And there's destruction going on somewhere else.
But never to this extent, sorry.
I know, obviously not belittling it at all and not comparing.
Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, I want to thank you too. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm the daughter of two Jews who grew up in Vienna, Austria, and had to leave during the war. And they never told me a lot of what was going on, but I've tried to study as an adult, and I feel like I've learned a lot from you today. So thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I thought it might resonate with you. I mean, as Carol mentioned, her dad, they didn't discuss much, and they moved over here. We're forgetting the past and moving forward, and a lot of their friends from Vienna came over, so they were able to reestablish some connections. But it kind of gives you an interesting perspective of the turmoil again that Paul was reflecting to. And I thought it was a wonderful analogy about the Titanic before it hit the iceberg. That yeah, I mean, like at the 39 World's Fair, they built the whole Czechoslovakia pavilion, and then there was no Czechoslovakia to go home to. So many people that came over for the 39 World's Fair actually ended up establishing their lives and their futures in America because World War II wiped out their chance to go home. So it'd just be interesting to know how many people from the Jewish Palestine Pavilion stayed in New York, not planning for it originally, but stayed here as a result of it.
There was an exhibit at the Battery Park Jewish Museum about Auschwitz, with obviously the death camp, but in a portion of it told the story of two merchants from Poland who came to the World's Fair to had a pavilion display their wares at the World's Fair, left their child with the grandparents, and then couldn't get back. And their child and grandparents were killed, and they were in America and survived the war because they had the good fortune for themselves, but the disastrous consequences for their children. So there must have been many people who came to the World's Fair and either were saved because they couldn't go back.
All right. Have you looked into any of the other unsanctioned fairs, like the 39 San Francisco Fair? Because I believe the Israel movement was represented in their Hall of Religion as well.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to find that. There was certainly not no Palestine Pavilion 39, but I'll look at that. If you're telling me there was an element there, then I've missed it, and I'll go back to look at
Yeah, it
it.
was a Hall of Religion. It was, again, pretty much like the Hall of Religion at the New York Fair or the Chicago one, where everybody was invited to participate. And if you look online, you can find their entire catalog and souvenir booklet has been put online in PDF form. I just thought that might be of interest to you.
Thank you.
Other thoughts from other members? Again, I just marvel at how many hours you must have putting into finding it, because finding something for the that Brussels exhibit and that sort of stuff cannot be the easiest thing. You must have a very active eBay account like I do.
I do. I do.
What would you say was your biggest surprise in doing all this research? Anything that really was a wow moment for you?
I got from the Zionist archives, I guess the Economic Committee, American Economic Committee for Palestine, which was business leaders, their archives found their way into the Zionist archives in Jerusalem. And so there is mountains of World's Fair items in this archive in Jerusalem, but they sent me a pile of what was already scanned. And the back and forth discussion by cable between America and Palestine in organizing this, and it makes you think how complicated it was to create a World's Fair at this time. This is one pavilion. To have this coordination with countries around the world where there were telephones, yes, there's cables, but no faxes, obviously no internet and any of that. And so that in some of this correspondence, like, I'm going to come and talk to you about the pavilion. I will be on the SS ship leaving Haifa on Tuesday, and I will be in New York in 16 days, and we'll talk about it then. And just imagine the coordination. I think the New York Public Library has all the archives for the World's Fair, so there similar correspondence must have taken place with all of the nations, and how to coordinate all of that in a time when there was not that communication, and things were, you had to start a lot earlier, because every piece of correspondence could take 2 weeks to go back and forth. So I thought it gave me an appreciation of the difficulty of organizing not just this pavilion, but World's Fairs in generally at those times. And 1939 was much more modern. Like the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia had, like, how did they do that? I'm sure there's people who studied it. That was the most amazing thing to me, yet it got done, right? Like, how do we live without our BlackBerry when it goes, or when it's not a BlackBerry, iPhone? Canadians say BlackBerry. We were proud of it. With our iPhone, how did things get done without our iPhone? Things got done, and so that to me was most interesting.
One thing I found interesting was that, that catalog, you have all the items that were sold. It's got to be really great to know what the things were and track them down. But so many of the exhibits were brought into World's Fairs on a tax-free basis, with the proviso that at the end of the fair, you have to take it back home, or if anybody buys it, you have to pay the taxes on it. And that happened for the 39 San Francisco World's Fair, that now they had stuff they couldn't take back to places like Japan because of the war. And it was interesting because they obviously started making exceptions for places like Israel or Czechoslovakia and that. But in 1940, when they were shutting down the fair there was very little love going on for the Japanese at the time, and particularly when Pearl Harbor hit. They actually made them burn the pavilion down that they were trying to give away because nobody wanted to pay the taxes to save it. So it's really gratifying to see that some of their artwork has survived, and I hope you're successful getting those three figures back on display over in Israel.
I have a feeling I will be, but it's going to take some work.
One thing I want to offer, if you're in contact with the archives over there and there's anything from any of the World's Fairs that I have, I'd be more than glad to share any of the pictures I have if it helps them tell the story. So just, feel free to put them in touch with me and I'll see what I can distribute. Now, Jim Brown had an interesting thought. Jim, do you want to unmute and make the suggestion?
Yes, the idea was basically a book with all this information that he's been researching in the form of a book. But then it dawned on me the Arcadia books are very picture-oriented, so this thing would be probably more pictures than text, but some form of book, to keep on the subject of Israel as it pertains to World's Fairs.
That's good. So someone else has suggested that, so.
Yeah, Arcadia is a very good company to work with. They tend to go for very local, generalized books. For the railroads of Southern Virginia, sort of thing. But when I pitched the book to them on, doing the things like the World's Fair, I said, this can be sold all across the country, all across the world. I'd be more than glad to put you in touch with the editors that I work with. That they'll ask you, of course, who's going to buy it, and go, well, how many Jews are there in the world? So, you have to work with them to get over their mindset about, there's a book on Cleveland or Des Moines, or, when I wanted to do the book on Vancouver, oh my God, that's a really small market. Well, they've ended up selling very well. And I think Jim has an excellent suggestion that
Thank you.
it could be a real good possibility for you.
I would love an introduction. Thank you. And thank you, Jim, for the idea.
You're welcome. Hope it happens.
Yeah, I think you could do a lot with it. Wayne, you had something?
Yeah, I wonder if in researching the Chicago World's Fair, you came across any involvement of Julius Rosenwald in the pageant. Julius Rosenwald was the head of Sears and a tremendous philanthropist. He established the Museum of Science and Industry and refused to have his name put on it. And he did many other things quietly, like establishing grammar schools in the South for Black children. So I wonder if he was involved in the Jewish Palestinian work at the World's Fair.
Yeah, so I actually read this book about Julius Rosenwald's biography. And so he's a most impressive gentleman, heroic, frankly. And you allude to the fact of grammar schools. He funded 5,000 grammar schools for Black people in the southern United States. And I just read an article, I don't know, two-thirds of students in those areas were educated in schools that he supported. But there was nothing in this book that talked about the World's Fair. I can't remember when he passed away, but yes, it was Sears Roebuck was like the Amazon of the day. He was like the Jeff Bezos of his time. Thank you for the question, but I have not seen any connection between him and that event.
Yeah, it's so many of these things that people do take a low profile, that they can be working so much behind the scenes, and you just don't know it. And unfortunately, things do get lost over time. Anyone else? Any other hands waving or anything? Don, go ahead.
Yeah, first off, I want to thank you. It was a fascinating presentation. I wish a few more of us had been here. I'm going to encourage everyone to go back and watch the video because it was really quite good. Thank you for presenting all of this. I have a rather obscure question, actually. One of my hobbies I've got right now is researching the history of a World's Fair that took place in Dallas at Centennial Exposition. And they had I think it was called the Hall of History. Let me check here. Yeah, Hall of Religion, which had a section on Judaism there. Do you know if any of this was involved in that, or was that just something done? Are you familiar with any of that at all?
I have in my collection a postcard that is a Jerusalem model at that Texas World's Fair.
Ah,
And if you don't mind me turning around, I will pull it out and I'll show it to you. But I have never been able to find anything. Sorry, so I've been at home during the pandemic with all my toys, so I sort of know where things are. I have never been able to find anything about that fair. Yeah.
it's a hard fair to research. I've got a few things here, and there were a couple of books written on it, but it's a hard fair to find a lot about. Ah,
And it says here, Jerusalem, the Holy City, Texas Centennial Exposition, Dallas. And at the back, exact replica of the gates and wall of Jerusalem. There are 5 gates, and that's history. But that's the only reference, Texas Centennial Exposition.
and so that was a model probably inside. Well, it might have been inside the Hall of Religion. I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, I have
I
not
do
been
have a
able-
guidebook for the fair, so I'll take a look and see if I can find any reference to that model. It's pretty
Please,
thorough.
and if you do, you please let me
Yeah,
know. I have not been able to find any reference to it anywhere.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious because it sounds like they were visiting most of the fairs at the time, and this one definitely had a forum for it. But I wasn't looking for it, but I hadn't seen anything referring to it, so I'll take a look
Right.
again.
All right, thank you so much. I mean, there's a whole Billy Rose had a whole thing there, right? So there's a new
Yeah.
biography of Billy Rose, and he talks about that Texas. It discusses that Texas. I think he had a saloon show or something there, or a Texas show in that World Fair.
I know what you're referring to, but yeah, I can't pull off the top of my head. But yeah, he definitely had a show there, very popular show there, actually.
Right.
So that fairgrounds, I'm planning on going back in the next couple of weeks to rephotograph it. It's remarkably intact. I mean, all the buildings from the Centennial are mostly still there, and all their Art Deco glory. It's a wonderful place to visit. So
Yeah, please let me know if you find anything.
I will definitely do so. As a matter of fact, I think I'll pull my guidebook. Find here.
Well, again, I thank you for taking your time out of your rainy Toronto day. I hope you get some sun. We'll send some of it our way. But I think this is, the kind of neat thing about World's Fairs is that it, takes people of different backgrounds and different, mindsets and brings them together. And hopefully it kind of educates them all. And, I know for me, I've mentioned before that, I went to the '64 World's Fair as a kid, and one of my most fascinating conversations, which is stay with me forever, was a young woman from Egypt that was dreading having to go back home at the end of the '64 World's Fair because of the way they treated women over in Egypt, and she was really hoping to stay in New York. And I had never really thought much about it because we just treated everybody okay in New York, and you realize other people in the world do have other sets of problems and issues and things like that. And it was a real eye opener to I guess I was 13 at that particular year. So again, it's interesting to see how much the Zionist Movement was using the World's Fairs as a marketing tool, and espouse the philosophy. And you mentioned the one guidebook. They were saying we're here to prove in part that we're not shiftless, lazy people, that sort of thing. And it's you have to overcome stereotypes, and having a kick-ass pavilion showing that you're doing pretty damn well is probably a great investment of time and money in helping to do that, and made a big difference. So again, I really appreciate it much, David. Thank you for your time and effort.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul's got his hand back up. I had just muted you, Paul, and your phone rang, but feel free to unmute.
Okay. The reason I want to say 2 more words, when you talked, David, at the beginning, you showed that picture where you were at the Montreal World Fair in '67, remember? When you were a 7-year-old. To me, I was at that same World's Fair. It was very important to me. Why? Because this is the time that I met my wife. We got married during the World's Fair, and every day when we lived in Montreal, we used to go to the top of the mountain after a day's work and watch at midnight the fireworks from the World's Fair. So you brought back such memories. I was there. Not only that, but there was an Israeli pavilion. There's also a separate Jewish pavilion. I don't know if you know that.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
There were two pavilions there, separate. Anyway, I just want to tell you that to me, this was very meaningful, brought back unbelievable memories. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have another comment from Yuko, Dennis, and should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, yes. It's interesting that Jews go from being shiftless to, as a prejudice or concern, to being controlling the world.
Yeah.
The current anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I guess if you hate somebody, you can find some way to warp your hate into any particular, fashion. They're too short, they're too tall, they're too thin, they're too fat. Whatever you can. It's hate morphs, unfortunately.
That's exactly right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you. I will take this recording. We'll put it online, and hopefully more people can watch it. I know Saturday mornings are tough, and as people are getting ready for Halloween, some people are telling me they had to go and spend the time, getting their houses decorated for the big day tomorrow and stuff like that. So it's actually interesting if I start looking on some of the because I keep saying it's so worth doing this. The small number of people. And I'll put it up, we have, I think the high today, we had 13 people, but then you put it on YouTube and you realize you had 200, 300 people look at it. It's delayed gratification in a way, but it does get the message out. And I think this is an important one to tell. So we'll get it out there, and I ask everybody to please pass it on to your friends and fellow associates. And I think they'll learn something from it. I know I sure did.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, again, I'll keep in touch, David. And if you are interested in pursuing a book, I'll sign up for. Well, I guess Jim can get the first copy. I'll have to ask for the second. But glad to put you in touch with the folks from Arcadia and walk you through their process. It's pretty painless.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity. And everyone, be well. Enjoy your day.
Right. Now, what's a good traditional Jewish goodbye? I know how to say hello.
Hello.
But
Shalom is goodbye, but lahitrat means I hope to see you again one day.
great. Well, thank you much. Bye.
Bye-bye.